I always think it is best to do your applause first, just in case you change your mind by the end after you've bought the product. Couple of things. I'm carrying this around because I've got nowhere to pin it on. So if I drop it, I'll have to stop and apologise, and excuse me for that. And I've also got lots of bits of media to work with, so please excuse me if I fumble a little bit with all the bits of technology. It's not my strength. But the thing I want to talk about tonight, I mean, other than, of course, it's my own favourite topic, which is, this is an opportunity for talk about nothing except myself and my research. And for a narcissist, that's about as good as it gets. But I want to talk about it in terms of a fly-on-the-wall perspective. And the reason for that is partially because I have grown up with this field, because I did my PhD at a time when it was just starting and there was only one paper published in the area. So I've kind of been a fly on the wall in the development of a field that I think is now reasonably well established, and there are some of you in this room who do that work. And also because of the way that I do research. And so I do research by observing people. And for those of you who are wondering what it is that I do when I do research, I thought it might just be easiest if I was to show you what I do. Apologies for the quality of any of these clips, but I'm the person behind the camera. Does that show okay up there? So what you're seeing here is a couple of gentlemen in a bar. They're writing on a napkin a rather major multi-million-dollar deal to reinsure oil rigs and energy and marine cargo. So they're writing that up on a napkin, and as you'll see shortly, one of them will sign that off. So that's pretty much what I do for research. I hang around in bars watching men. So if you've wondered why I'm not here as often as I could be, well, you know, sometimes the mornings are a little tougher. But realistically, what I do want to talk about today, other than my hanging around in bars with men, is why I study strategy as practice, what's the purpose of studying it the way that I do, why I think it's important for us to look at organisations in this way, which is perhaps a little less traditional, mention obviously some of the challenges. It's actually not all that easy to get people to let you video them when they're hanging around in bars. And I think we need to address in a business school in particular, but increasingly in any area of research, is it relevant? And so I want to touch on that before ending with some cautions about the academic field that we're in. I think that the format of this is that I run for about 45 minutes and then you get a chance to ask one or two of your nastiest questions. If there's something you don't understand on the way, by all means put up your hand and I'll be pleased to ignore you. But seriously, if there's something you don't understand or you want me to deal with it, I can deal with it right away. Otherwise, there's plenty of room to ask over questions or drinks. I will touch on, as I talk, 3 studies. None of this is about any specific study, but I will touch on 3 studies that I think have been the most significant to me. The first was my PhD, in which I studied strategizing in universities by actually sitting in 51 strategy meetings in universities within a year, as well as looking at the minute books and collecting data on those for 6 years previously. My claim, and I'd like to state that while I'm here, Julia, is that having done that for my PhD, I shouldn't have to sit in any more university meetings. Thereafter, I was lucky in 2005 to get an AIM fellowship, which allowed me to spend 2 intensive years studying infrastructure companies, particularly vertical or functional separation. So some very critical regulatory shifts that they have to take and how they implement those. And more recently, I've been fortunate to get another grant looking at, and I'm currently involved in the second phase of that with some of my colleagues in this room, where we've been doing an audio and video ethnography of the global reinsurance industry, covering Lloyd's of London, Bermuda. Yes, that means we had to hang around in bars in Bermuda. And we're now doing continental Europe, different kinds of bars. Okay, so why strategy is practice anyway? I want to just give you a very selective historical tour here. It's necessarily selective because otherwise it would take too long. Basically, strategy as we know it as a teaching phenomena, at least, as a, came up in the early 1900s at Harvard under what came to be the Harvard case method, in which they taught about the general manager. And that grew into being their business policy course, and they would get general managers in to come and talk about how they ran their companies, and students would listen to that and write their case papers on that. And following the war, that actually became much more stabilised as the Harvard case method approach. The problem with this was that on the one hand, it gave lots of very good practical insights into business problems. But the other hand, it was atheoretical. This was just people talking about how they did it their way. And there's no particular reason to assume that that had any rigour or generalisability. And so, a little later, perhaps in the late 70s, early 80s, it became much more economics driven. And any of you who've done strategy will know Porter's 5 forces. That must be the most successful strategy theory product out there on the market. It sells well. It's still selling today. And that model came up out of Porter's PhD and became one of the dominant ways of driving the economics approach to strategy. And of course, the strengths of that is that it was theory-driven. So taking an economics approach moves us away from this atheoretical problem of people telling their own stories about how they did strategy. And this comes from actually a dialogue that Richard Whittington and I had with Joe Bauer, who's a professor at Harvard, and Rob Grant, so he was from the initial general manager school, and Rob Grant, who sells one of the leading economics strategy textbooks. And one of the things that Bauer points out is that as we moved into this economic rigour, which was much more scientifically accurate, so managers disappeared from our strategy teaching and increasingly from our strategy research. And even where you did get some mention of a company president or a CEO, they were just a proxy for the firm. The unit of analysis shifted from what people do to what firms do, and as part of that, in our research, we began to count things. Now, this is not, for those of you who are economists in the audience, a pop at the economists, but there have been a few little criticisms about that, which is that if what we teach is always underpinned by rules of behaviour that are economic models, then one of the problems is that if the assumptions on which those models are built don't map very well to the specifics of the practice, then it's difficult to see how those models apply. And there's been some criticisms of whether that has maybe led us in the wrong direction. So under the circumstances, we thought about this as strategy as practice, which is let's bring the managers back in. And this has been a turn in management research more generally, to rehumanise it and to bring managers back in, but to get away from the problems of the atheoretical I did it my way stories. Because of course there are theories that are the theories of people doing things and constructing and living in their worlds. And these are the sociological theories of practice, which, it's true, don't have the clean, simple models like Porter's 5 forces. Easy to remember. There's 5 forces. You've got 5 fingers. So it's much easier to remember 5 forces than the messiness of reality and practice. But nonetheless, that's what we're aiming for in strategist practice, to look at how people in organisations do things. Basically, we study the practitioners, and we define that pretty broadly, like who is a strategist? Well, increasingly, particularly in knowledge-intensive firms, in service firms, it's the people who deliver the strategy at the point of sale. What we saw happening in that bar is people making large multi-million-pound bets on their company. Not all of it's done in the bar, I have to say. There is a bit of thinking that sits around behind that. But those people are strategists too, and we should be studying the decisions they make. We should be studying the things that they employ, the technologies that are increasingly supporting the way they do that, the practices. And finally, praxis is just a fancy practice word for the work they do. So we're basically studying strategy workers, the work they do, and the tools they use to do that work. And of course, it's not only out of a theoretical interest. I do believe in relevance, and that it's important that by understanding how people do what they do, we can enhance their competence. So that's why. But how do I do it? How do you get close to practice? It's all very well to say we want to be relevant, we want to study practice, we want to develop theories about how people do things and live in and interact with their world. So, is it possible? It's true. I spend a lot of time just hanging around in organisations. Is it possible to be a fly on the wall? That's a question, really. When you're in an organisation, you're visible, and that's not possible not to be. But if you hang around enough, as this cartoon suggests, they cease to dissemble. They've got jobs to do, so they get on with their work, and you sit around while they get on with their work. And that's the type of research that I do. I'm the woman, that's me, the one up there. And some of you may recognise organisations with these people in them. And what we're really doing in this type of research, this ethnographic research, and I know that there are some of you in this room who do that type of research very well, is we're looking for naturally occurring experiments. So where psychologists might set up lab experiments to isolate the things that they want to see, we say the field already has all the experiments. They occur naturally. What we need is to go out there and observe them and work out ways to analyse them. As part of that, we are increasingly assisted by digital media. So much digital media is now inexpensive, portable, affordable, and we can cart it around with us. At the same time, the people that we want to study are used to it. I mean, looking at the average age of the audience, I'm assuming most people here have taken videos or at least photos of themselves and put it up on their Facebook websites, shared things on YouTube. Certainly, the more embarrassing it is, the more appropriate it is to put it up if it's your friend. So from that perspective, it's made our job easier as ethnographers. Because if we want to go in and video record them and audio record them, A, the equipment is cheap, B, I can run it and analyse it on my laptop, and C, my participants are so relaxed about that. They do it on their phones all the time in the pub. And since I'm in the pub, but seriously, it has made our job easier to collect this kind of data, and we can take it home and we can replay these incidences over and over again. But the point is, what we're trying to do by capturing people as they do things, ethnographers aim to study behaviour in the wild. So we're not aiming to isolate behaviour, separate it out, put it in an artificial situation so that we control for all the problems and the noise. We're actually saying the noise, the problems, the situations, they are part of what we want to study. We want to see people in the wild and then try and work out how that sort of behaviour shapes what organisations do. And of course, when you come home and you've spent, as we have, for example, in our reinsurance study, you've been spending time across 12 different firms in 2 continents, then you're going to come home with hundreds and hundreds of hours of video. When we spent 2 years in infrastructure firms, we audio recorded 286 meetings. They went from 15 minutes up to 9 hours. So that's a lot of data to bring home. So we're not really just making kind of anecdotal evidence from 1 or 2 cases. Actually, we're turning this into a massive corpus of data. Just as those of you who work with big panel data have a big corpus of data, so do we. And we can count it. This is just a little piece I did. This is a little piece of a little piece I did in the infrastructure study. We actually just realised people laugh a lot, so we counted all the laughing. When I say we, I use that word loosely. An intern counted all the laughing. An intern re-listened to all those meetings and counted all the laughing. So, that's great. Look at that. We can tell you when, and we can do lots of different statistics on when they laugh, how often they laugh, whether it's big laughter, little laughter. We can even turn it into things like this, which show you that, on average, people laugh more at the start of a meeting and at the end of the meeting than they do in the middle of a meeting. See, you're laughing now, but is that early laughter or late laughter? You don't know how long it's going to go on. The problem is, of course, that's actually not the point of what I'm doing. Yes, we need to render it down to little units so that we can see what the patterns are and we can try to analyse that. But knowing people laugh more at the start than at the end doesn't tell me much about what that does to the way they make strategic decisions or how they implement strategy. So we then actually have to have theories and ways of thinking about it. And this is just a little example from the university study that I did. I'd never actually even intended to notice this. But a little later, we went back and looked at all of the 51 meetings and looked at the 306 agenda items that were discussed in order to see, because we knew from watching these people that often little ideas come up that could change the strategy. So which ones do change the strategy, and is there something about the way the meetings are conducted that allows that to happen? Well, we found that the majority of discussion doesn't. The majority of things that go on in meetings are about stabilising the existing strategy. And I actually think that's a really important finding, because we do want to stabilise the existing strategies, don't we? I mean, we'd like to actually achieve some of the strategies we set out to do. And so clearly doing something to stabilise them in meetings does help. So all that time you're sitting there going yada, 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 you are actually doing something helpful. That said, we did find that variations emerge, and they emerge in one type of discussion. I'm not going to go through this in detail. They are given the impetus to be maintained through some of these little practices or mechanisms. Invariably, if they are actually going to lead to some sort of change, they then go on to a particular type of conversation we identified, finally coming out of the meeting in a way that allows, over time, over a series of meetings, for a change in the strategy to occur. It's quite important to know which types of conversations allow variations to even potentially emerge, and then which mechanisms allow them to, at some stage, create a change in the strategy. Because then you can possibly even purposively do something like that. More importantly, we found that sometimes variations emerge in two places, but depending on the path that they follow, they may not allow variations to emerge. In fact, they may be deliberately suppressed or unintentionally suppressed. And in particular, we found that under a different mechanism altogether, they can be deliberately suppressed without ever even getting to the point of decision. Now, this is not totally unusual. We do know that there is non-decision making, but it's quite helpful to know what are the little tiny practices, if you break data down, that allow things to be promoted or not promoted. So that's just an example of how we can do some of this type of, what we can do with some of these big sets of data. Someday, over the next 10 years, Jane and I will find out what all that laughing does. And then we'll be able to present you some little maps like this that show you when and how often you should laugh in meetings if you want to be more effective. Why is it important? Why is it important to do this kind of stuff? I mean, is it just because I'm, a little bit obsessive compulsive and I like to spend lots of hours listening to people laugh and staring at tiny incidents of data? No, it's not. It's because we need to surface the taken for granted. So when you're in meetings, you don't even think about how you run the meeting, what the agenda's like, how it's structured, which bits come first. You have forgotten to notice that. So in surfacing the taken for granted, we're also trying to make the familiar strange. What we're trying to do is show people what they do that they don't even think about, because why would you think about it? You just do it. Do you think about how you get out of bed, brush your teeth, do all that kind of stuff? You just do it. But it's a very foreign thing to someone from a different world. And so the way that we use this, and this is what we actually showed to our reassurance participants to try and show them some of the strangeness of their own behaviour, is if you look at this picture, this is an Indigenous American about to start a rain dance. Now, to us sitting in this room, this is not typical behaviour. The clothing, the posture, the gesture, all of it is the strange, the unfamiliar. And most amazingly about it, it's a rain dance. But we all do know that that's not what brings rain. And presumably they've worked that out too. So why are they doing this? Well, the point is, what looks so strange to you has meanings and attributions to them that go beyond whether it creates rain or not. And lots of the things that happen in organisations look just as strange as that to people who are not in that organisation. So what we're trying to do by making the familiar, the everyday strange, is get away from what I call the danger of hagiographies. So the hagiographies, the lives of saints, where we exonerate the great business leaders, the best companies, and that's how we want to tell strategy stories. But hang on a minute, didn't we all jump on the .com wagon? And then we found out that, oh no, that was the .bomb wagon? Wasn't there a bunch of us who said that Enron was great and WorldCom was great? Oops, no, shit, we were wrong there too. So basically, strategy as practice is not looking for who's fantastic. Strategy as practice thinks that the ultimate compliment is, you're so mundane. And the reason for this is, a lot of excellence is actually very mundane. Let me show you an example, or explain to you an example from another ethnography. Not in the business field. This is an ethnography of Olympic swimmers. Now, I think we can all be pretty comfortable about what constitutes excellence in swimming. If you get to the Olympics, you are more excellent than other people. So it's not like firms where, well, it's Enron today and it's just a bloody big case of fraud tomorrow. You get to the Olympics, you got to the Olympics, you were better than everyone else in your country that year. You get a gold medal, that's the year you were the best in the world. So it's very easy to say what is excellent, or at least to identify where I can go to see what is excellent. So this person did an ethnographic study over 3 years, comparing club level and regional level swimmers with Olympic swimmers. And what they find is excellence is mundane. And so it's not that, when we see someone win an Olympics, we look at them and go, oh man, superhumans, they're amazing. They're so different, they're so talented, they're not like me. Okay, well, they may not be like me, but actually they're like a lot of us in this room physically. The difference is in the tiny activities that Olympic swimmers do when you compare them with club or regional swimmers that are carefully repeated, drilled into habit, and as they say, not any one of those activities is extraordinary. You can find any one of those activities in any number of swimmers. You can find that physical body type and shape in any number of swimmers. What it is the way they bring all of those things together in a whole, at bringing all those little mundane actions that makes excellence. And so when we go to look for excellence, we should look for what is mundane, what is habitual, what is done over and over again. And of course, the other thing we need to think about is that if we want to help people to either sustain what is excellent, if we can surface it, make it visible, make the familiar strange, we can show them so they can know what adds value, and we can also show them if they want to change it, what are some of the things they're doing that maybe don't have quite the meanings they attribute. And again, let me just emphasise that through the swimming example. There was one woman that he followed who in 1 year went from being a regional level swimmer to being a world record holder. In that year, she made the decision, she made two important decisions. One is she would turn up for practice on time every time, and that every single time that she swam, she would do every move as if it was in a competition. That's only 1 year, one very small change of habit. But can you see the meanings of that? We all aim to turn up to things on time. But she didn't say, I aim to, she said, I will. It's attributing value to the act of training. It may only give her 3 more minutes than some other people, but it already says her motivation and the importance she attributes to this activity. And then she routinely practiced every competitive move every time she got in a pool. In 1 year, she was excellent. Before that, she was just a reasonably talented club swimmer. So excellence is mundane and it's small things. And that's what we should be looking for if we want to help people do strategy better. What are the little mundane things they do? That said, I don't recommend you go to a CEO and say, I want to study you guys because you're so mundane. Think of something slightly more flattering on the way in. I want to study you guys because you're so excellent. And that's pretty mundane. Okay, what are the challenges? Well, performance anxiety, I think, is one of the things we all have, and fair enough too, because we should have performance anxiety in strategy. Because strategy is all about performance. That's what we're trying to study. Why do some firms outperform other firms? And this has been really the province of economics. And Porter's Five Forces model has been tested extensively. It's such a good product, lots of people have tested it. And interestingly, what they've found is that it only shows between 4 and 18% of the variability in firm performance. Now that's quite good in itself, because I reckon if you can show that much variation, that's a very robust result. But can I also point out that that's 82 to 96% that is not being explained. So I guess it leaves a little room for us to do some other type of research to look at performance. And that's my point, that in strategy as practice, we're not looking for the exact same performance outcomes. So we don't need to have performance anxiety. I think it's a useful outcome to show, for example, as I did, how and where variations in strategy arise and what types of mechanisms you follow in order to sustain those. So if you want to change your strategy, it's quite helpful to know how to do that. And that might be a performance outcome. So we're looking not to explain necessarily the quantitative differences between firm A and firm B, but the little qualitative differences that might add up to a change and to excellence. Those tiny things like getting up, going to practice every day on time, that might make the difference in why some firms are better than others. And again, this comes from this ethnographic study of swimmers. If we just want to make quantitative improvements, that could be doing more of the same thing. But if the same thing is not the right thing, should we be doing more of that? Is that good advice to give a firm? Or should we be actually looking at the nature of things? How does they do things? How could they modify those things to do them better? Because one thing that is very clear is that the difference between an Olympic level swimmer and a club level swimmer is not just doing more of what a club level swimmer does. It's true they do more, but it's not just more of the same thing. It's more and it's different things. And that's what we're looking for if we want to understand performance from this perspective. Let me show you an example of what I mean by some mundane, small things that happen ritually and habitually in firms, and then we can have a talk about what that means, if I can just find it. Okay, I'm sorry, this is obviously disguised, so you can't see anyone's faces or anything that gives stuff away. What you are seeing here is something that happens routinely every day in Lloyd's of London. This is a person signing a slip. What they are doing is agreeing contractually multi-million pound, dollar, yen deals through this activity. You see somebody stamp, which is to authorise from their firm. You see them take a valuable pen, a Mont Blanc, and to enter the figures, which are actually on their computer on an electronic screen, to enter them on a piece of paper, sign that off, and then this is actually quite a complex process. That little thing goes on for around about 20 minutes, and it takes 3 people to do it. So after they've read it, touched it, signed it, often in interesting inks, burgundy ink was one of the ones we saw, but what they're doing is they're attributing a lot of symbolism and specialness to this. They're using a special pen, a Mont Blanc. I mean, you could sign it with a biro or a Bic. You would if you were an academic because you couldn't afford a Mont Blanc. And then the ritual, the way they go about it, it then gets handed to their underwriting assistant who will scan it to turn it into an electronic copy again, which can then be emailed around the world again afterwards. And then it'll be handed back to the broker. And there'll be several of these slips, and this will take 3 people around about 20 minutes. That's an hour of time, actually, when we think about it. Now, we watched that process, and this is taken for granted. In Lloyd's, it happens all the time. But we went to Bermuda as well, and the Bermudians were doing the exact same deals at the exact same price, because that's the way this business is done. Once the price is agreed, everyone globally does it at the exact same price. So they were doing the exact same deals at the exact same price. They were often putting on much bigger bets because, it's a much higher capitalised market. And it was taking one person would get all of those slips in the office, print them out, sign them all off, get them all done that afternoon, send them back. So why was it taking 3 people so long to do it in Lloyd's, and one person could do all of it in Bermuda in so little time? And so we thought about what are these things that are so small and yet so different to do the same business. And of course, one of the things we came up with, let me show you that in a minute, is ways that they could improve their efficiency in Lloyd's. For example, by not spending quite so long turning something that was already electronic into an arts and craft paper document, only to make it electronic again and send it around the world. So on the one thing we can do is we can make it more efficient. And some of you will be sitting there thinking, okay, so is this just Taylorism? Have you developed the Taylorism of strategy, Paula? Well done. The Taylorism of knowledge workers, where you just can isolate their labour and turn it into little units that you can string together more efficiently. And no, I don't think so. I mean, I do think there is some of that in this, but actually there's nothing wrong with efficiency, even if it is creative or strategic. But it's also about quality. It's about the quality of what you do. And the quality that was being attributed to that act was not where the quality of Lloyd's decision-making came. And so we developed them from watching multiple incidences of these things. We've developed them and wrote of useful little process maps that show them where they should deploy their most important face-to-face resources. Remember, it's people who have to go and have all those conversations and dinners and outings and turn up to pubs. And actually, sometimes people just want to go home. So a valuable resource is people. When should you use people? We could show them where they should use people, where they should use email, under what particular diagnostic circumstances phones were useful, under which conditions, under which types of programs and investments and bets it was useful for them to use face-to-face interaction. We could then show them, as they got closer to the end of the process, when they could start to remove the face from a decision that's already been made. And that last little thing we just saw, how they could, if they did all this right, do all those wonderful judgmental things with people and end up processing slips at the end without basically wasting valuable human resources that could be used for other things, even going home and reading a story to your kids. I mean, I know they get big bonuses, but that doesn't mean they shouldn't also get a chance to go home occasionally. So, I mean, really what I'm pointing out is, if we trace these things through, if you can take home the work and you can study it closely, you can start to separate out the different rituals and show them which ones of them have the meanings they attribute and which ones are perhaps no longer so relevant. So that's one of the challenges, which is just, you know, dealing with performance outcomes, separating out big masses of data, like lots of people doing ritual things like stamping slips and using pens, and coming up with some sort of logical conclusions that can help organisations. And as part of that, you know, I say, is it relevant? This is a big challenge for business schools. You can't really open the FT on Business Education Day without seeing some sort of criticism or rally to arms for us to be a little bit more relevant. And, you know, fair enough, we call ourselves a business school and we are teaching people about business, so I guess it's reasonable that business people would like us to be helpful to them in some way. And so I think that this is one of our challenges, and I have to say, sorry, not taking a pop at the economists, so I've removed economics from some of my paraphrasing here. But one of the criticisms is, if we measure ourselves solely by the rigour of our research, and if our research is solely the type of research that is done in ways that is remote from actual practice, then it is just possible that these are relevant criticisms. And I'm not saying we shouldn't do that type of research, because we should. If it can explain up to 18% of firm variation, then we absolutely should be doing research like that. If it can show us economic, you know, models that are robust, reliable and rigorous under a lot of wide situations, then that's important. But all I'm saying is that microethnography could complement it. What I'm talking about is microethnography. And it's an applied science as well. It's been used in other fields. So, for example, LeBaron and Steek show how police departments extract confessions in murder cases. They analyse the videos of police interrogations, and they can show the bodily positionings and the flow of conversations that can lead to a murder confession. I think that's a pretty applied outcome. And in particular, it's an important applied outcome if the person isn't guilty, wouldn't you say? For us to understand what the process is. And maybe the police are just more evolved than us, because actually they've even been playing anthropologists for a while. So, for example, New York Police Department employs an anthropologist with a PhD in anthropology to do all their key executive training, because she can actually understand what they do in the field and what kind of training they need to cope with the situations that they're going into. So microethnography is a very applied science. And indeed, business has begun to understand that more and more. Xerox was one of the first to employ ethnographers and anthropologists on its staff. Intel has a corporate staff that has, it has a department of anthropology and ethnography. Tesco used a set of human geographers to go and scope out how people actually shop and live and work in order to make better shopping fronts that we more adapt to people's lives. So lots of businesses have started to understand that if we understand what people do, we can do business better. So ethnography is not some kind of just woolly stuff that I happen to like doing because I'm a little bit nosy and I like hanging around in bars. It's actually something that can be quite applied as well. And I think it gives us relevance in two ways. One is the theories and the research that inform our teaching. Some of the criticisms that strategy teaching has had is that as it's moved away from looking at human beings as human actors, but more as proxies for what firms do, so it's been more and more concerned on firms and as profit maximisers and as the people in them simply as agents for profit maximisation. And some of the problems and criticisms that have been levied at that are some of the ethical problems that we've come across in some way a part of this, because actually we do psychometrically test in financial organisations when we recruit for those who are most motivated by financial rewards and the things that they can buy you. And so I'm not saying that's a bad thing. Clearly we want these people to earn their money, and that's a good thing. But it is just a question of, have we redressed the balance too far one way? And can something like strategy as practice give us a chance to bring back the human with their values, their judgments, their moral dilemmas, and the way that people actually act? And so, this comes from Jarzabkowski and Whittington, the dialogue that we had. We just started to separate it out into the experience of teachers under the initial Harvard thing was they were practitioners. They could come in and tell you a lot about business, but they couldn't put it in a theoretical context. They could just tell you about their business. So we moved to this much more theoretical way of thinking, and we employ people with degrees in finance and economics, PhDs, who are going to study those areas in order to tell us how to identify, create, and appropriate better value for firms. And that's great. We want to know that. And we are doing that. I'm not saying replace that. I'm saying let's complement that. Let's employ people who do organisation theory, who do sociology, who do anthropology, and study what people do in organisations and what difference that makes. All kinds of people. And so I think we are doing that, and I think it's a challenge for us to do more of that and to bring these types of theories into our research. At the same time, I think we need to be using these techniques to address important business questions. Currently, that's exactly what I'm trying to do, put it that way. So one of the criticisms, and we're studying the reinsurance industry, it's a reasonably major financial service. One of the criticisms that's been levied at financial risk-taking is there was an over-reliance on models, and, relatively informed people like the chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank have suggested that perhaps some of the problems, not all, are due to an excessively narrow perspective on risk, and that perhaps we need to appreciate quantitative and qualitative indicators in how people take risks. So it's not saying replace, I'm not saying kill all the economists, although I have seen an article entitled that. What I'm saying is they're doing a great job. They just need a little bit more help, support and complement from people like us who are doing a different but job that's equally interested in those kinds of phenomena of how and why firms and people in them do things. And so the things I'm looking at the moment, and it's an industry commission study, so I think that's a good thing. In the industries acknowledge that they want anthropology and they want ethnography and they want people to look at them, is we're looking at a very complex global financial industry. We've had sign-up that's allowing us to cover something like 94% of the global market. We have all of the Forbes top players in our sample participating with us, and we're looking at the importance of things and spaces. So how those people were sitting together in that little situation where they're stamping the slip, how and when people go to bars, what types of technologies they use, how they use the models, the computers, the artefacts. That's what we're trying to study, to show what other things influence risk-taking decisions. And this is quite, I've been fortunate. Industry fellowships, and when I finish this, I'll go on to a European Union fellowship to study in more detail this industry. So both academia and industry are suggesting it's important that we start to look in a different way at all kinds of business problems. And I think that the thing we're bringing in here, there's a big push towards interdisciplinarity, that this is interdisciplinary. It is interested in economics, it is interested in economic sociology, but it's also interested in technology studies, the technologies people use and how they shape behaviour. It's also interested in ethnography, the science, if you like, of interaction and how people interact. We want to know what people do, with whom, what tools they use when they go out there and bet the company. Because when they bet the company, they bet your pension and they bet your future as well. So that's kind of, we're getting close to the end. You can start that louder levels of laughter again. High at the beginning, a little bit in the middle, lots at the end. Always good. I want to finish just with some cautionary things. I think that there are, because we're able to get better access, so maybe because firms are thinking that this is important to them and they're letting us in more, and because we're doing these on a much bigger scope. We're doing a global ethnography. It's been very challenging for us. Some of my members of my team are in this audience. It's been very challenging for us to do this. Because how do you have different people on different sites collecting these type of data? So we need skill development to learn how to do multiple site team ethnography, because it's largely been the pursuit of a lone researcher or one or two people. We need a lot of methodological development. I'm coming home with hundreds and hundreds of hours of data and I'm trying to turn that into something sensible, and there's a lot of noise in there. And I need to perhaps, have better methodologies in order to work out ways to analyse this type of data. I need to work with people in communication studies, media studies. They do this all the time. That's what they do for a living. They could maybe help me. that could help all of us. We obviously need better theoretical development. And again, in business, we're borrowers anyway. We borrow from economics, we borrow from finance, we borrow from sociology. Let's borrow from communication studies. Let's borrow from anthropology to get better theories to understand how and why people do the things they do. And finally, I do think we need to be cautious. Just because you can bring a video home and watch it over and over again doesn't make the square of video you're seeing more real necessarily than what you experienced when you were out there in the field. So I think we do need to analyse what is digital media doing to the field of ethnography and, reflect on how that's shaping it. So those are some of the challenges, I like challenges, it's kind of one of my things. So over the next 20 years, which is about the span of my remaining career, I plan to work on some of these things. I won't get complete answers, but I'm sure lots of you can help me. And the other thing I would just like to say in conclusion is that I'm not really a New Zealander. And while I am devastated by the ashes, today is Australia Day. And I don't know if Julia knew that when she asked me to do my presentation today. But how appropriate, an Australian on Australia Day doing her inaugural. So I'm going to conclude with the obligatory photo of a kangaroo in the sunset.
We have about 10 minutes for questions, if anyone would like to ask. First up, okay, first.
I'd like to thank Paula very much for demonstrating that, as ever, the Greeks got it right and doing a quick rehash of Aristotle for the 21st century, with the mundane, excellence being mundane and a habit, and the need for balance. And then to comment that perhaps, biased comment, perhaps in terms of people who analyse data, you might consider talking to statisticians?
Well, yes, because we do come up with these mass corpus of things which good quality stats could help. I have to confess, there's a little weakness in myself there. But we need, truly, it's an interdisciplinary field. Yes, I have been known to talk to them, but mostly about other things. But I mean, I think there is definitely, this is interdisciplinary, and you can get useful statistical patterns from breaking qualitative data down into units, and then as long as you can work out what the meanings are or the values you want to attribute, you can then do some very useful pattern matching, and we have played around with some of that. So I think that's true. And I also like the Aristotle point, because actually it's the practical wisdom that comes from there, that underpins a lot of philosophy of practice. Yeah.
Paula, very interesting talk. Thanks very much. Completely new to me. I've recently spent a lot of time working in public sector organisations who are strategic. And there's two words you use that really kind of connect in my mind. I'd be interested to hear a bit more about narcissism and the mundane. You didn't connect them in the talk, but in my mind they sort of connect because strategic leaders are often looking, sometimes rightly at the horizon, but not the mundane.
Yes, I think I used the word narcissism in reference to myself, and clearly I'd never used the word mundane in the same context. I do think that what you're talking about is the inspiration and perspiration of strategy. And so a lot of people think only about, strategy, that's the inspiration. And the rest of the time, and if you ask them, they say, I'm not doing strategy now. Well, what are you doing then? And when you sort of unpack that, that seems to me to be strategy, what you're doing. So you're actually making sure about this, and you're checking that, and you're making sure, and then you're going to talk to the analysts, and then you're reinsuring some investors. Well, that all seems like strategy to me, just because it's not your big idea. And one of my most startling findings, one of my most intriguing findings, I think, more than startling for me, was that in my university that was the most successful by a range of indicators, what they were really good at was maintaining their strategy. They didn't change it, but God, they were good at making sure that every day they got out there and did it like they wanted to. And so I think, there is a big argument for maybe changing the way we define strategy. It's not only about those big whizzy things, it's about all the little things that go on underneath.
Thanks very much. I'm just interested on this idea of digital media in ethnography. you did mention is something quite new that you've been working on for some time. Just want to find out how you handle issues like ethics, the ethical aspect of taking, people's pictures, and how that is included in the initial negotiation for access to those pictures as well. And then I've got just a second question here. So you did mention about the fact that when you do find out areas where, let's say, labor hours could be saved through a process, you do talk to the management of those companies about those time savings. Just want to find out if you delve a bit deeper into areas such as how they implement those strategies and how resistance is handled within that area as well.
I like your Tesco's 2 for the price of 1 strategy and questions. Okay, question 1 about the ethics. Yes, I think that's a real issue, actually. We're very careful about that in terms of the agreements that we make. But one of the things which actually, Michael's running a symposium at the, he's been in the team that's been doing this video ethnography, he's running a symposium at the Academy of Management. One of the questions we are exploring in that is ethical issues in a few ways. One is the ethical issues, even if you do show people these type of data, that they may privilege the visual of your interpretation. And so their own interpretation of the visual that you show them, rather than actually, hang on, I'm trying to deconstruct something and show it to you here. The other thing is it even ethical to show people something they did themselves a little bit later? So there's lots of questions like that. But we get around the majority of the ethical issues in the way we would in any other situation, which is everything is informed consent. So, I wouldn't dream of taking anybody's picture or anything else without them having full consent of that. That said, I think there are bigger issues about that, and that's why I say we need to question what we're doing to ethnography as a field as we bring more digital media in. Your second question was, we don't just look at labour saving. We actually look at how to deploy labour more effectively. So if you're going to use face-to-face, use it here in these situations. For those types of clients, do this. For those types of clients, do that. Simply do a better triage system and know where to invest your labour better. Particularly your scarce resources, which is socialising with people. That takes a lot of time. The results from, I think, a few pieces, it's not only this research, but other research, yes, firms do implement some of it. They're selective. They implement the bits they want to implement. Some people are perhaps a little less receptive to bad news than others because, remember, you are making the familiar strange, and people like the familiar. They don't want it to become too strange. So, if you meet that resistance, hey, I'm not a consultant, and my job is not here to change you. It's to hold a mirror up and to allow you to see whether you'd like to change yourself. Yeah.
Can I throw in one question, Paula?
Please do.
Are you limited by language?
I'm extremely limited by language. I only speak Australian, and I'm getting the hang of English.
In terms of your studies, in terms of studies you can do, are you limited to something that basically applies to people who develop their strategies in English? Because that's the approach you've been taking so far, or can you spread that out? Can you work with partner teams in German, Japanese, Chinese? Is that something on your agenda? Or?
Well, it's interesting that.
Problems of the method as well. Whether the one analysis would be.
There's a few things in that, and I think obviously if you can collect, if it's ethnography and you're trying to study people in the wild, it's much better if you can study them in their own language, because that is their wild. That said, you have to acknowledge the limitations of any research, and if the only way you're going to get any data internationally is to do it in your own language, I think it's still better to get some international data than not to get some. But we are just starting a European phase, and we're working with teams in Madrid, Paris, Zurich, Munich, Hanover. So if you want to know where I am, at least in Bermuda it's in English. But actually, because these are global businesses, unless they're doing domestic business, they're mostly doing it in English. Very occasionally Europeans will do, not in their own native language, in the language of the person they're speaking to, but a lot of it, and I've sat next to Europeans doing European business where, it can be a little complex, but Michael's a German speaker, so that's helpful. So, guess who's getting Hanover and Munich? Munich's supposed to be nice. I'm not a Spanish speaker, but I have a very Latino personality, so guess who's getting Madrid? So yeah, it is limiting, John, but on the other hand, global business is done in English, so I just try to console myself with that and, you know, accept that maybe in the future I might work with global teams who collect data in their own language, but then we'll have the problems of, we'll have other problems of trying to understand who did what.
You also have to accommodate culture, presumably, in that concept of not just a question of language in different businesses. In global international businesses, the common language may well be English, but the way people work in France and Germany and how they interact in meetings, how they write stuff, how they work, what they say to their line management is very different the way necessarily in the UK.
Yes, and that is actually one of the critical points that we've brought out, and that is seen as a strength of the study, because one of the criticisms a lot of financial sectors is that they've become too globally connected and they're dominated by an Anglo-American model. And this is actually, reinsurance is one of the few financial services that is dominated by continental Europe. And so it can maybe offer some counter lessons about cultural diversity and different models of doing business. And also, we're specifically looking at, it's a less globally connected industry. Although they're all writing the same programs, they're not doing it through the same globally connected systems. And we're hoping that being able to pull out some of that cultural diversity and to be sensitised to that is one of the ways that we can maybe show how culture makes a difference. And it is, and I think what's a value for us there, and I think that is a value, is you go in as the stranger, you see it as strange, whereas they see it as normal. So what is normal to them in a German or a French or whatever culture, for us is abnormal, and we see it more easily. And there are, you know, then our challenge, of course, is to make good sense of that cultural difference. It's not much use to come home and say, hey, it's different in Germany just because they're German. We have to think of some ways to make that sensible.
One last question, I think.
Just to ask, you make it appear very simple at one level, watching people do stuff, and I'm wondering whether both organisations and also researchers might be seduced by thinking this is an easy methodology. You've kind of hinted that training and the rigour of training is very important. Can you comment a bit more about that?
Oh, yeah. This is quite time-consuming research. I wouldn't sort of advise it for people who aren't basically fairly masochistic. No, if you don't, this is not the easy alternative. It's not like, hey, I'm pretty social, I love chatting to people, and this looks like an easy way to do research. Instead of having to learn formulas and do numbers, I'll just go and chat to a few people, and then I'll come up with a few nice little pretty process maps. That'll be good. Actually, the pretty process maps are underpinned by hours and hours and hours of analysis and mind-numbing. You know, we really do separate out the 51 meetings into all the different units of different agenda items. We really do have to go home and listen to get all of those bits of humour. And that's just to extract them into pieces of humour. Then after that, we have to do analysis to make sense of what does that humour do. So A, it's quite hard to keep contact with people. You've got no legitimate reason to be in their organisation other than the strength of your personality and some way of convincing them that they're going to get something useful out of this. And they're not going to get something useful in the first 2 weeks. So you've got to convince them to let you hang around for an awfully long time before they get the payback. And secondly, you're going to spend, you know, a lot of time at home when you get home with that data, replaying it and replaying it. And what seemed fascinating and social and good fun when you met them in the bar is going to seem slightly nauseating the 30th time you've watched them do that little move in the bar. But that's probably the moment at which you're ready to make sense of it, because you've lost your love of it and have begun to really see it. So yeah, but I believe in it. I love it, yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Paula, for an absolutely fascinating lecture, from which I take away at least 2 things, which is in the infrastructure industries, they have 9-hour meetings, so bad luck, university executive teams. Opportunity for me here. And, sell Mont Blanc, clearly. It's no future at all. So can we